Hi, I'm Tom Burgess, and thank you for listening to the Weekly Wake Up, where we raise the alarm on what's really happening in our country. Although after the recent couple of weeks, I'm not sure anybody knows what's going to happen next. This show is part of the Real Agenda network of podcasts for political change, which you can subscribe to on all the major podcast providers. Today we're going to be talking about human rights and bring you up to date with some campaigning news. But first, let me introduce the team. Oops, they've ignored the whip and they're not here. But they're not going to be expelled from the party. My merry band of 4 panellists, hosts. One is moving house, one is out of the country, and the other 2 are slaves to their desk and retained for late meetings. So I hope that Hugh, Satya, Oliver and Leah will be back next week, or at least 2 or 3 of you. But the show must go on, so it's just me and the studio cats, Gary and Brian. But all they've offered is actually no comment. Well, there you go. Thanks very much for that, indeed, Gary and Brian. Anyway, just a reminder that we're always looking for new people on the team, whether to help with content production, marketing. So contact us now if you'd like to get involved, and also let us know what you think about the Real Agenda. Email us on info@realagenda.org. In fact, next week we've got a new recruit coming to the studio to meet the team, so we look forward to meeting you, Zoe. Thanks very much for contacting us, and we'll see you soon. We've also had an email from Richard. Thanks for your comments, Richard, who says it's a great show and great timing. Well, that's good to know. And he added, thanks for caring so much that you want to put some time and effort into at least trying to make a difference. And he went on to offer some comments on how to make the show more engaging. Thanks very much indeed for that, Richard. So do send your comments in. We love to hear from you. So instead of talking about what's going to be going on, what's been going on in Parliament, or there doesn't seem to be a Parliament at the moment, we want to mention a few items related to the Real Agenda. And that's about reducing inequality, resolving poverty, and bringing about greater social and economic justice. There's a meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos in January. No, I haven't been invited, but it is a useful time to focus on extreme inequality. The Fight Inequality Alliance is planning a week of action. Now, last week there were 16 of us from various campaigning groups who met to decide what was going to be the most effective. So watch this space, or rather listen to this space, and we'll give you an update. Now, it just seems to get worse as MPs, and for that matter, us voters, keep attacking and insulting each other, so that we have become more and more polarised and divided. It's partly the curse of social media, but not completely. And in an attempt to bring back a sense of respect, cooperation and consensus, the campaigning group Compassion in Politics is producing a code of compassionate conduct in public life. The author of the first draft, that's me, has just submitted his initial recommendations. We all create the wealth, but our outdated capitalist system means that this is only accumulated by a few. So any move to invest in public services and build a future for those struggling financially, we have to ensure that more of that wealth is returned to the community for community use. To put it bluntly, we will need to tax wealth more and income less, particularly those who do not have enough income to live on. Our political parties seem afraid to stand up on this. So one way to do this is to get those that hold a lot of wealth to stand up and say they should be taxed more. The idea has been discussed with the Equality Trust, Tax Justice UK and Oxfam, and as a start, an open letter has been written or has been drafted to the Prime Minister, whoever that might be, that week. Having seen the first draft, I'm suggesting some changes that could make it more impactful. Better get on with that one then. The approach of working together with the wealthy to bring change was a strategy I actually outlined in my book, From Here to Prosperity, which is available at all good bookshops and online or otherwise. And as I said, there is a strong business case for the wealthy and business leaders to invest in our country. Because one of the objections is that while people are open to pay more taxes, but they don't want it disappearing into a black hole or indeed wasted through bad management. But they would be quite prepared to pay more if they knew it was going to go into something, say, like just into the NHS, for example. Now, some want to overthrow the capitalist system and some want to stay where it is, propping up the rich. The grown-up approach is to make the capitalist system and the businesses that operate in it do so more as a force for good. Now, I had a fascinating conversation with Paul Lindley, the founder of Ella's Kitchen, which he grew to a leading food brand, always always keeping people more than profit at the centre. Now, Ella's is now a certified B Corporation, which means it has to meet the highest standards of social and environmental performance, transparency and accountability, as well as aspire to use the power of business as a force for good. Now, I recorded an interview with Paul, which will be released next week. And also we'd actually spoken to Chris Turner, the Executive Director of B Labs, which looks after the B Corporations community in the UK, in episode 55 of The Real Agenda as part of our Profit per Purpose series. Now that's available online if you want to have a listen to that too. So this week we're going to talk about human rights, seeing that the team is not here today and we will not be having our discussion. And so what it is, we got, in case you missed it earlier, we're here as an interview that I did recently with Francesca Klug. Now, Francesca was awarded an OBE for services to human rights in 2002 and was the joint winner of the Times Justice Award for outstanding contribution to civil justice in 1998. And while she was at King's College Law School, she advised the then Labour government on the model for incorporating the European Convention for Human Rights into UK law, which then became the Human Rights Act. Now, Francesca was a commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where she was the lead commissioner on the Human Rights Inquiry established in 2009. She was a member of the government's task force responsible for overseeing implementation of the Human Rights Act. She's currently a visiting professor at the London School of Economics Human Rights and also at Sheffield Hallam University. And her recent book, A Magna Carta for All Humanity, Homing In on Human Rights, was published in 2005 to coincide with the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta in 1215. And coincidentally, and also intentionally, the office phone number for The Real Agenda ends in the numbers 1215. So clearly, Francesca is an expert in this area. So I started by asking Francesca, why do we need a Declaration of Human Rights?
Well, I think the one word you missed out there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a moment in time in 1948 when it was adopted by the United Nations. Because we all know there's been some iconic documents before then, like the Magna Carta, 800 years ago now, of course, American and French iconic Bills of Rights. But 1948, of course, was a particular moment in time. If you like, they were living through a moment like we are. And the people from the countries that were free, and it's very important to say this because the whole of sub-Saharan Africa was still under imperial rule in 1948, but the peoples from the countries that were free, in that they weren't under imperial rule, formed the new United Nations. And there was a big push, largely from NGOs at the time, quite prestigious ones, some religious ones, Christian, Jewish, Catholic organizations, and some very famous international human rights lawyers, many of whom themselves had been refugees from Nazism, to say that the United Nations is going to learn the lessons of the League of Nations, and it's going to stand up for all human beings just because they're human, rather than based on the nationality that they happen to possess and that could be taken away from them at the whim of their governments, and create a declaration that speaks to and for all the people and the peoples of the world, to use some of the language that they invoked.
So how did it actually come about then? What happened?
Well, the first big push was to persuade the fledgling United Nations, even as it was being formed, even as the Charter was being written in 1948, to include human rights in the Charter. That was the big initial push, because they knew if the phrase human rights was not in the Charter of the UN, it would have no mandate to develop a human rights declaration for all humankind. And that push came during the war. There was a push from the UK, there was a push from various countries in Latin America, from America itself, from different parts of the world, saying, what are we fighting for? Those who were on the side of the Allies, either directly or in their hearts and souls, were saying, well, what is this war all about? This is a moment to think about, why have we got to this point where humanity is on the edge of destroying itself, let alone all the extraordinary scientific type atrocities that had happened during the war that we'd not really seen their kind before. And they said, if there's a United Nations, it can't just be about nations. It has to be about and for human beings, and every human being everywhere. That's an important point about the every human being everywhere, because during the process of drafting the Declaration, after the Charter had been adopted with human rights inserted in its mandate, and Eleanor Roosevelt, a well-known name who described herself as a tea bag, do you know that?
I didn't know that.
She was an eccentric, powerful and an amazing character in her own right, though a lot of people think of her as the wife of the wartime US president. But she said, women are like a tea bag. You only know how strong we are when we get into hot water. So it was the force of her personality, partly, that brought together an extraordinary group of people, different cultures, different nations, to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under the auspices of a specially convened Commission on Human Rights. But the debates, which I've read most of them, not all of them, there are one or two experts that have read them all, are absolutely fascinating. I know this can sound nerdish, but they speak to right now. They speak to right now because they were discussing what it is to be a human. They were discussing the need of humans to identify within groups, within communities, even within states and nations, but that there has to be something more than that if we are to live on this planet together.
We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so why don't a lot of governments keep to it, those that have signed up?
I think it's first of all a question of understanding exactly what it was. I was about to say that the newly colonized countries like Egypt and India would often embarrass the more established states, and like Britain, France, and actually including America, because they were insisting that if we're talking universal here, it must mean everyone, and it must mean people who are still under colonized rule, who are fighting for their freedom. And after much debate, indeed the colonies, as it were people living in those colonies were included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, America itself had its own little embarrassment in this field, as much of the southern states of America had institutionalized racism, legalized racism, and segregation. And Eleanor Roosevelt found herself in a very awkward position at times. But they too had to accept the universality of the document. Universal is the most important word attached to the Declaration of Human Rights. René Cassin, one of the prime authors, who was himself a refugee, a French refugee from Nazism, I think 25 members of his immediate and extended family were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. He said Hitler challenged human equality even before he challenged liberty. So for him, equality was the most important value. And once they started talking about equality, not only did it mean that the Declaration had to apply to all humans everywhere, but it had to include real and meaningful equality. And so what we in the jargon, economic, social and cultural rights, things like a right to a home, to housing, to education, to basic health care, to social security if you're out of work, to employment, were included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Now, how radical was that? The idea that all human beings everywhere have basic entitlements, that there should be an international body responsible for overseeing that, because governments, states could not be trusted, democratic or otherwise, not to take away the rights of minorities in particular, and that all human beings had to have real equality, not just the formal equality of the Enlightenment Bills of Rights, but real equality, which meant certain fundamental economic and social and indeed cultural rights. Why haven't governments done that? Well, do you really need me to answer? Of course, this was an aspirational document. It's not legally enforceable, though it's led to 20-odd legally enforceable treaties and many other declarations and UN bodies.
So that's why the UK has its own Human Rights Act.
Well, the European Convention on Human Rights, if anyone ever read its preamble, instead of what we read in the press, makes it absolutely clear that it is the European embodiment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's often said that Churchill drafted it. Now, this is an uncomfortable thing to talk about because nobody wants to reduce anyone's enthusiasm for the European Convention if they get that because they see Churchill as a great war leader. But actually the British contribution was largely to tone down the Universal Declaration, extract all the economic, social and cultural rights from it, bar the right to education and the right to a home, but it isn't quite the same as a right to housing, and qualify and limit nearly all the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights further than they were already qualified. So the British contribution was, if you like, to anglicise it. However, no one should deny, again, the force of personality of Churchill behind the Council of Europe, and indeed appointing British representatives to draft the European Convention, notably Maxwell Fyfe, who'd been a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. He was behind the idea of a European ideal of human rights, which drew indeed from the Universal Declaration.
There's the Universal Declaration, then there's the European, but that's still not law in each country. Each country then has to adopt that.
Right. Some countries within the Council of Europe, which is a broader body than the EU, but sort of exists alongside it, but separately, they automatically incorporate any treaty, any international treaty they ratify into their law. But in our country, we don't. So we went along, right up until the millennium, the new millennium, without the rights in the European Convention in our law, relying on the Magna Carta, as it were, which doesn't say anything about free speech, doesn't say anything about free conscience, definitely doesn't say anything about discrimination. In fact, in its original form, there were some nice little discriminatory statements in it, particularly in relation to women and Jews, but that's not surprising. It was a medieval document. Finally, so what used to have to happen is to access our legal rights under the European Convention, people would have to wait the 8-10 years often to get to the European Court of Human Rights. There's a wonderful dead case law under the European Court of Human Rights, i.e. of people who'd already died by the time their case got there. So finally, the Labour government in 1998 incorporated most of the European Convention into our law under the Human Rights Act. And it was interesting that they chose to label that a Human Rights Act. They could have done what Canada did, for example, when they incorporated the equivalent international treaty into their law and added a few bits and pieces and called it the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. And there's an argument that if we'd called the Human Rights Act the British Bill of Rights, maybe people would have connected to it more. On the other hand, by calling it the Human Rights Act, it labelled it what it actually is, which is rights because we're human, not just rights because we're citizens. And the idea that all humans have certain entitlements just because they are human is the treasured idea that comes from the Universal Declaration.
So some of the basic things in the Universal Declaration, and I guess carried through to the Human Rights Act, are not really followed through by government. I mean, in terms of housing and right to health, welfare, and so on.
Well, I think we all miss a trick when we think of the Universal Declaration and all the treaties, including the European Convention, that came out of it, and indeed our own Human Rights Act. When we think of it as purely a legal document, purely granting legal rights, and then, surprise, surprise, the government finds for various reasons it doesn't want to grant them, at least not to everybody, and at least especially if they cost money. If we look at it purely through that prism, I think we've lost some of the spirit behind the Universal Declaration. René Cassin, who I mentioned earlier, he described the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a cry of humanity, a protest against all that humanity has put itself through, and a determination to learn from those tragedies and atrocities and to ensure that humanity moved forward. Now, the role of something like a Human Rights Act is to inspire and encourage and educate people, not just to stand up for their own rights, but to aspire for a better society in the country they live in. And there is little doubt that the contention that has greeted the Human Rights Act is precisely because it's partly played that role. It's led to a debate, a discussion about who we are, what we stand for. Some people see that as something to regret, but I see positivity in that. That is, and it is absolutely that radical edge of human rights that can sometimes be lost when we perceive it as a legal document, particularly when we forget the word human and just call it a document of legal rights, when the purpose of it was to understand what human beings need in order to live a good life in a good society in harmony with each other. That's what's behind it. So it's bound to lead to contention and debate if it's worth its salt, in my view.
But it seems to me, having read through the Universal Declaration, that it really is a basis for good government. And if government knows what it needs to do, it's all in there. What would you think?
I completely agree, but it requires human beings to fight for it, for that to happen, is my point. And it was always thus. It was always intended to be. It was described by Eleanor Roosevelt as a moral document, the first moral document for the human community. So, if you describe something as a moral document, if you describe something as a document of protest, it tells you that it's only going to work if the human beings who it's written to, I mean, the Universal Declaration talks about the people and peoples of the world. It addresses the people of the world before it addresses governments, and it's quite clear in the preamble that unless humans take it to their heart and fight for it, this ain't going nowhere. So where humans have fought for it, for example, in South Africa, the Freedom Charter was very influenced by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Nelson Mandela, he wrote eloquently at the 50th anniversary of the UDHR, we now just experienced the 70th, at the 50th he wrote about the personal inspiration it gave him in 1948, just as apartheid was being introduced into South Africa. So the government wasn't just listening to it, it was doing the absolute opposite, having said that, to what was enshrined in the Universal Declaration, although South Africa abstained from it. It was one of 5 countries in the world that did not pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It abstained. But he was saying it gave him hope, because he thought, yes, other people are in this fight with me, and I'm going to fight for these rights and for these aspirations.
Just tell us about the angle and approach you took in your book on this issue.
I wrote the book to coincide with the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, which is why it's called a Magna Carta for all humanity. Now that is to paraphrase what Eleanor Roosevelt said when the Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948. She described it as a Magna Carta for all humankind everywhere. Her point being that the Magna Carta was for a very particular group of people, all of whom had to be citizens. It wasn't even for serfs under the medieval system here, but this was for everyone. But it took its inspiration from the idea of freedom and peers, the word that is used, equality in other words, within the Magna Carta. And so I wanted to make the point that great as the Magna Carta was in its time in many ways, and iconic as its inspiration has been, that in the jubilation that this country was going through whilst we were congratulating ourselves on our 800-year document, we were at the very same time threatening to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights and start a domino effect of countries thinking they could rip up these treaties and charters, and it didn't matter if they did.
Why would we want to withdraw?
Because it's onerous on states, and there's a discourse which matches our time completely, that universal human rights are part of globalism, they are a globalist mentality, and they create vassal states by providing limits on national sovereignty. We were actually at the front of this discourse long before it was energized by events like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. I was trying to say that it's a very dangerous game we're playing here, that this was a remarkable achievement only 70 years ago, not 800, but 70 years ago when the Universal Declaration was drafted. It's not perfect, there were things it left out, it is not applied all over the world as you said, but it stood as a landmark, a standard to achieve, and we rubbish it at our peril, was my point. And what I do here is go through many of the debates that led to the Universal Declaration and try and show what they were trying to do, which was to create an ethical document and an inspirational document that speaks for now, more than they couldn't undo what they'd just been through. The Second World War was over. They wrote it for us now, and it's right now that we need it most.
Particularly here in this country where we've got like 14 million people in poverty, it seems quite clear that we're not taking this sort of thing seriously. And it's not the number one priority, and from that matter, the climate change as well.
Absolutely.
These are so critical.
Absolutely. Well, you saw how Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, he's a creature of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every one of those UN positions, committees, special rapporteurs, they all flow from this amazing document. It has had impact to that extent. When he talks about poverty here or in the United States, he's ridiculed, rubbished and insulted and told he's interfering in our national discourse. That's what we have. They will win, the people who agree with that, unless we, the people, stand up and fight for the achievement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and understand it belongs to us, not them. But it does require us to wake up and understand that, and I try and trace the debates, the ethical debates as much as the legal debates that led to it and then followed it, including our own vexed debate here over the Human Rights Act and whether we should withdraw from the European Convention, which, by the way, is not over, because we've already had warning from people close to and within government that when we've left the European Union, they will return to this issue of the impact of the European Convention on Human Rights on our national sovereignty, as they would see it.
What I would like to do, and you started to touch on it about us standing up for this, it's what can we the people do to take action on this and protect human rights and promote human rights so that they apply to all humans. What can we do?
On the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I happened to be in Paris, and I got out at the Gare du Nord, and all over the Gare du Nord with huge banners, one from each article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, celebrating the 70th anniversary in the People's Station, done by the People's Mayor. We need those of us who are on this side to be taking this kind of action. We need to bring it to people so they understand what it is. That's here in the UK I'm talking about. And we need to there have been developments since the Human Rights Act was introduced. For example, the idea of rights respecting schools, the 3 R's. UNICEF took this up, and there are a number of schools where they do learn now about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not because of the national curriculum, but because they've adopted this UNICEF initiative, and they learn about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is another product of the Universal Declaration. But we also just have to demand, of course, the rights within the Declaration, but in a way that respects humanity, because there is a radical progressive version of these rights that hasn't always respected humanity. And what I mean is that rides roughshods sometimes over the rights of individuals and minority communities. And of course, that gave some of the radical progressive means of achieving these rights. For example, through the experiment of the Soviet Union, we could go on giving other examples. It gave the search for these rights a bad name in certain quarters. Now, there's a revival of that radicalism, which is a wonderful thing, many people might think. But I would really advise that movement to take note of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its insistence, as Judge Brenda Hale said in an early British case under the Human Rights Act, that it is the job of all human rights instruments to make us understand that democracy values every individual equally, even if the majority don't. And that's what I mean, and I think she meant, by a human rights democracy as opposed to a populist-driven democracy. And that's the competition of different versions of democracy that we're witnessing right now here in the UK and, of course, in the United States and all over parts of Europe.
Thank you, Francesca. That was most enlightening, and it's such an important topic. The respect for all humans is so essential for a civilized society and for the well-being of all. The inequalities and the severe hardship suffered by so many is because we do not put human rights for all humans first. So that's the show for this week. I hope I've woken you up a bit and that I have helped to inform and inspire you, and you'll want to get involved in making change happen. Email us at info@realagenda.org or contact us via our website, realagenda.org. So what's up next on the Real Agenda? Coming soon in our new series, Profit for Purpose. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be talking to Paul Lindley, founder of Ella's Kitchen, and also in another episode to Julian Richer, founder of Richer Sounds. And of course, the weekly Wake Up will be back next Friday. They promise that they'll be here, so that will be great, and we look forward to that, and do listen in. A special thanks to our sponsors, Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. And don't just take my word for it. Reverse Media Group was just listed as the 9th fastest growing privately owned tech company in the UK. Now, one thing is certain, people want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. It's urgent, and it's up to us to make it happen. That's the Real Agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.